The clinking of silver against porcelain was the heartbeat of Aurelia, a sound as steady and refined as the clientele it served. For Ilara Vance, it was the soundtrack to her exhaustion. Each chime of a fork, each murmur of a low-toned conversation was another minute survived, another dollar earned towards the mountain of bills on her small kitchen table. She moved between tables with a practiced grace, her smile a carefully constructed mask that hid the weariness in her bones and the worry that gnawed at her soul. Her hands, though, told the real story. They were chapped and red from the constant washing, the harsh chemicals, the heat of the plates. And they carried a secret. Tucked into the pocket of her crisp black apron was a small worn tin. Inside was a thick, herbaceous balm, a concoction of lavender, chamomile, and a deep, earthy note of vetiver she couldn't afford often, but saved for the worst days. It was her grandmother's recipe, a salve for what she called weary hands and a worried heart. The scent was her private comfort, a whisper of home in the sterile opulence of Aurelia. It clung to her skin, a faint, clean aroma that smelled of rain-soaked earth and quiet gardens. Most people never noticed, but Julian Thorne was not most people. He sat at table 7, the prime real estate overlooking the city lights, a monument to his own success. As CEO of Thorne Industries, a ruthless real estate development firm, he didn't just occupy space, he conquered it. His suit was a razor-sharp testament to his wealth, his watch a quiet boast worth more than Ilara's car, and his voice a tool he used to carve the world into a shape that pleased him. Tonight, he was entertaining 2 potential Japanese investors, and the performance of his superiority was in full swing. Ilara approached the table, her water pitcher held steady. "Can I offer you more water, Mr. Thorne?" she asked, her voice soft and professional. He didn't look at her. He was in the middle of a grand gesture, describing a skyscraper he planned to erect. As she leaned in to fill his glass, he stopped mid-sentence. His nose twitched, a subtle, disdainful movement. He sniffed the air, his perfect brow furrowing. "What is that smell?" he asked, not to her, but to the air itself, as if she were a piece of furniture that had developed an odor. Ilara froze, the pitcher hovering over his glass. A hot flush of shame crept up her neck. She knew he meant her. "The balm." "I'm sorry, sir," she managed. He finally turned his gaze on her, and it was like being pinned by a shard of ice. "That scent. It's agricultural. Are you moonlighting at a farm?" He gave a short, humorless laugh, a sound meant to include his guests in the joke at her expense. The investors offered weak, uncertain smiles, unsure of the social protocol. It's just a hand lotion, sir," Ilara whispered, pulling back. "For dry skin." "A hand lotion?" Julian picked up his silk napkin and waved it in front of his face, as if clearing a foul miasma. "My dear, you work at one of the finest dining establishments in the city, not a provincial barn. Whatever you're slathering on yourself, it's entirely inappropriate. It's interfering with the bouquet of my wine." He gestured to the half-full glass of vintage Bordeaux, as if it were a victim of her assault. Ilara's face burned. She could feel the eyes of the nearby tables on her. All the poise she had so carefully cultivated crumbled, leaving her feeling small and exposed. "I apologize, sir. It won't happen again." She retreated, her heart hammering against her ribs. In the relative safety of the service station, she scrubbed her hands with unscented soap until they were raw, but the faint, comforting scent of her grandmother's love seemed to have seeped into her very skin, now branded as a mark of shame. At a small, quiet table in the corner, an older gentleman named Arthur Pendleton lowered his newspaper slightly. He had been observing the exchange, his keen blue eyes missing nothing. He took a slow sip of his black coffee, his expression unreadable, and turned a page, the rustle of the paper the only sign of his attention. He had been coming to Aurelia for years, a creature of quiet habit, always observing, always listening. And tonight he had heard something that stirred a memory buried for over 50 years. Ilara tried to avoid table 7 for the rest of the evening, trading sections with another waitress, Maria, who shot her a sympathetic look. But Julian Thorne was not a man to be ignored. When it came time to clear the main course, the manager, a perpetually stressed man named David, insisted she do it herself. "He's a major client, Ilara. Don't make waves. Just smile and get it done." Taking a deep breath, she plastered the professional smile back on her face and approached the table. The conversation had stalled. The investors looked uncomfortable, and Julian's mood had soured. He saw her coming, and a cruel smirk touched his lips. He was a predator who enjoyed watching his prey squirm. "Ah, the farmhand returns," he announced, his voice carrying across the hushed dining room. "I trust you've had a proper decontamination." Ilara kept her eyes down, focusing on the plates. "I hope you enjoyed your meal, gentlemen," she said, her voice tight. As she reached for Julian's plate, he deliberately shifted it, just an inch, causing her to fumble. A stray piece of asparagus, slick with hollandaise sauce, slid off the plate and landed on the sleeve of his immaculate suit. It was a tiny, insignificant stain, but Julian reacted as if she had thrown acid on him. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. The entire restaurant fell silent. "You clumsy idiot," he roared, his face contorted with rage. "This is a $5,000 suit. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Tears pricked at Ilara's eyes. Humiliation washed over her in a suffocating wave. I'm so sorry, sir. It was an accident. I'll pay for the cleaning, of course." "Pay for the cleaning?" He laughed, a sound that was pure venom. "You couldn't afford the button on this jacket. It's not about the money. It's about the incompetence, the sheer lack of professionalism. First the stench, now this. It's a disgrace." He turned to the manager, who had rushed over, his face pale. "David, I want her fired. Now. I will not dine in an establishment that employs such riffraff." David wrung his hands, his gaze darting between the furious CEO and his trembling waitress. He knew Julian Thorne. He knew the man could ruin the restaurant's reputation with a few well-placed calls and a scathing online review. Ilara was a good worker, but she wasn't worth that kind of risk. "Ilara," David began, his voice strained with regret, "perhaps you should go to the back. We'll sort this out." It was a death sentence. Go to the back meant collect your things. She was being fired, over a drop of sauce and the smell of her grandmother's balm. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. The worry for her grandmother, the rent that was due, the tuition for her online botany course, it all crashed down on her. This job was her lifeline, and Julian Thorne had just severed it out of sheer spite. She stood there, frozen, unable to move or speak, the focus of dozens of pairs of eyes. Julian watched her, a triumphant glint in his eye. He had won. He had asserted his dominance. And then a new voice cut through the thick, tense silence. It was calm, yet it carried an undeniable authority that made every head turn. "That's quite enough." The voice came from the corner table. Arthur Pendleton had folded his newspaper and placed it neatly on the table beside his empty coffee cup. He rose slowly from his chair. He wasn't a large man, and his suit was well worn, comfortable rather than fashionable. But as he stood, he seemed to command the room's entire attention. Julian Thorne turned, annoyed at the interruption. "I beg your pardon, this doesn't concern you, old man. Go back to your crossword." Arthur's blue eyes, sharp and intelligent, fixed on Julian. They held no anger, only a profound, steely disappointment. He took a step forward, his gaze then shifting to the distraught Ilara. "The scent," Arthur said, his voice softer now but still carrying through the room. "The one you so crudely insulted. Let me smell your hand, young lady." Confused and intimidated, Ilara hesitantly held out her hand. Arthur took it gently, his touch surprisingly warm and steady. He lifted her hand, not to his nose, but closer, inhaling slowly. A strange, complex emotion flickered across his face, nostalgia, sorrow, and a dawning, incredible recognition. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they were shining with unshed tears. He looked directly at the bewildered Julian Thorne. His voice, when he spoke again, was a low, powerful tremor that silenced every whisper in the room. "You arrogant fool," he said, his words precise and devastating. "You mock what you don't understand. Leave this girl alone." He paused, his grip on Ilara's hand tightening protectively. "That scent, that's my mother's secret scent." The silence that followed Arthur Pendleton's declaration was absolute. It was as if the air itself had been sucked out of the room, leaving only a vacuum of stunned disbelief. Julian Thorne's face, which had been a mask of smug fury, now registered pure, unadulterated confusion. "Your mother's what?" he scoffed, attempting to regain control of the situation. "What kind of sentimental nonsense is this? This is a restaurant, not a therapy session. Now, if you'll excuse me, this incompetent girl has ruined my suit and my evening." He made a dismissive gesture as if to sweep Arthur and his strange pronouncement aside. But Arthur did not move. He continued to hold Ilara's hand, his gaze locked on Julian. "I said, that is enough," he repeated, and this time his voice had an edge of cold iron that made Julian's investors shift uncomfortably in their seats. "You owe this young woman an apology." "An apology?" Julian laughed, a strained, incredulous sound. "For what? For pointing out that she smells like a compost heap and can't carry a plate without spilling its contents? I think not. Now tell me who you are that you feel you have the right to interrupt my dinner." A faint, sad smile touched Arthur Pendleton's lips. "My name is Arthur Pendleton." He said it simply, without any flourish, but the name landed in the room like a physical weight. A wave of whispers rippled through the dining room as patrons recognized the name. Arthur Pendleton wasn't just wealthy, he was a legend. A titan of industry who had built a vast empire in logistics and technology before retiring to focus on philanthropy. He was notoriously private, rarely photographed, but his influence was felt everywhere, in the hospitals he funded, the universities he endowed, and the companies he held silent, controlling stakes in. Companies, it turned out, like Thorne Industries. One of the Japanese investors at Julian's table, a Mr. Tanaka, inhaled sharply. His eyes widened as he leaned forward and whispered urgently to Julian. The color drained from Julian Thorne's face. It was a spectacular, immediate transformation. The arrogant, swaggering CEO vanished, replaced by a man who looked as if he'd just seen a ghost. He knew the name. Of course, he knew the name. Pendleton Capital was one of the largest, albeit most silent, institutional investors in his company. This quiet, unassuming old man in a worn suit held a significant portion of his company's fate in his hands. Julian's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. His entire world had just been upended. Arthur paid him no mind. His attention was now fully on Ilara, who was staring at him, her mind reeling. "Lavender," Arthur murmured, his thumb gently rubbing the back of her hand. "And chamomile, but there's something else. Something deep and woody." "Vetiver?" Ilara nodded, speechless. "My mother used to grow it in a small patch behind our house," Arthur said, his voice thick with memory. "She was a farmer's daughter. Her hands were always in the soil. She made a balm, just like this one, in a little tin she kept on the windowsill. She said it was for mending the body and the spirit. I haven't smelled it since I was a boy. Not since the day she died." He looked up at Ilara, his eyes searching hers. "Where did you get this?" Finding her voice, Ilara stammered, It's my grandmother's recipe. It's been in our family for generations. She taught me how to make it. She calls it a balm for weary hands and a worried heart." The echo of his own mother's words was so perfect, so impossibly precise, that Arthur had to steady himself. "A worried heart," he repeated softly. He looked around the opulent restaurant, at the chandeliers and the starched linen, and for a moment he seemed to see something else entirely. A small rustic kitchen filled with the scent of drying herbs. He then turned his gaze back to the petrified Julian Thorne. The fire was gone from his eyes, replaced by a cold, quiet finality. "You stand here in your $5,000 suit," Arthur said, his voice level, "and you mock a scent that represents more hard work, more love, and more dignity than you could possibly comprehend. This scent is the smell of my mother's hands planting the food that put me through school. It is the smell of her tending to my father's injuries after a long day in the fields. It is the smell of a legacy you tried to trample on your way to dessert." He released Ilara's hand and took a step towards Julian's table. "Mr. Tanaka, Mr. Yoshida," he said, addressing the investors with a polite nod. "I apologize that your dinner has been disturbed. I have a great deal of respect for your organization, which is why I must advise you that a man who shows such profound disrespect for the working people who form the backbone of our society may not be the most stable or honorable business partner." Mr. Tanaka stood up and gave a short, stiff bow to Arthur. "Mr. Pendleton, your wisdom is greatly appreciated. Our meeting is concluded." He and his colleague gathered their belongings, gave Julian a look of withering contempt, and walked out of the restaurant without a backward glance. Julian Thorne stood alone, his face ashen. His multi-million-dollar deal had just evaporated before his eyes. His career was flashing before his eyes. He turned to Arthur, his voice a desperate, pleading whisper. "Mr. Pendleton, I had no idea. Please, I am so deeply sorry. It was a misunderstanding, a terrible joke." Arthur looked at him, his expression one of pure pity. "The only joke here, Mr. Thorne, is a man who has become so wealthy he has forgotten the value of simple human decency." He turned his back on the disgraced CEO and walked over to Elara. "Young lady," he said gently, "your shift appears to be over. Would you do me the honor of sitting with me? I'd like to buy you a cup of coffee and hear more about your grandmother." The manager, David, who had been watching the entire exchange with the terror of a man watching his own execution, scurried forward. "Of course, Mr. Pendleton. Right away. Please, take any table you wish. The entire meal is on the house, everything." Elara, still in a state of shock, could only nod as Arthur led her to his small corner table, leaving Julian Thorne standing alone in the wreckage of his own making. The following days moved in a dreamlike haze for Elara. Arthur was true to his word. They met for coffee and then for lunch. He insisted on meeting her grandmother, a visit that turned into a 4-hour conversation over chamomile tea, where Arthur and the old woman spoke a shared language of soil, seasons, and memory. It was there, in her grandmother's cozy, sunlit kitchen, that the idea for a company was born. "Vance and Clara," Arthur had said, looking from the small tin of balm on the table to a faded photograph of his own mother, Clara, on his phone. A partnership of legacies. Elara's world transformed. Guided by Arthur's vast resources and mentorship, she found her footing with astonishing speed. Her online botany course became a full-fledged degree, funded by a scholarship from the Pendleton Trust. The timid waitress was meticulously peeled away, revealing a quiet, confident CEO with an encyclopedic knowledge of plants and an unshakable ethical compass. The company, Vance and Clara, launched a single product, the original balm. It became an overnight sensation, built not on slick marketing, but on the authentic story of two families connected by a simple herbal remedy. One rainy afternoon, a year after the company's launch, Elara was in Arthur's vast, book-lined study. The scent of old paper and vetiver from a diffuser mingled in the air. They were reviewing plans for their foundation's first major conservation project. "You never told me, Arthur," she said, tracing the outline of a proposed nature preserve on a map. "That night at Aurelia, it all seemed so serendipitous. My balm, your mother's memory. Was it truly just a coincidence?" Arthur looked up from his papers, his blue eyes twinkling. He leaned back in his leather chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Coincidence found the opportunity, Elara. Preparation seized it." He rose and walked to a heavy oak filing cabinet. He returned with a thick, leather-bound dossier and placed it on the desk between them. The name stamped in gold on the cover read, "Thorne Industries, Project Nightingale." Pendleton Capital had been building a case against Julian Thorne for months, he confessed. His business practices weren't just ruthless, they were criminal. He was gutting protected woodlands for luxury condos, strong-arming small landowners, and falsifying environmental reports. His arrogance was making him sloppy, a liability. We were looking for a way to oust him, but we needed a public, undeniable reason. Something that would sway the entire board without looking like a simple corporate power play. He opened the dossier. Inside were satellite photos of clear-cut forests, copies of forged documents, and sworn affidavits from displaced families. Julian needed to show the world exactly who he was, in a way no one could deny. I had been observing him for weeks. I knew he frequented Aurelia. That night, I was there specifically to watch him, hoping he would expose his own character. When he began his tirade against you, it was more than I could have hoped for. His cruelty was so pure, so indefensible. And you were the perfect counterpoint. Your dignity, your quiet strength. And then the scent. He shook his head in wonder. That was the part I could never have planned. It was a gift from the universe. You didn't just give me a reason to remove him. You gave me a story to build something better in his place. The revelation settled over Ilara, not with a sense of being used, but with a profound understanding of the intricate dance of fate and strategy. She hadn't been a pawn. She had been the queen that checkmated a king. Julian Thorne did not disappear quietly. Forced out of his own company, his name a toxic asset, he spent 2 years burning through his fortune, trying to claw his way back. His spectacular public downfall made him a pariah. He was left with one last, heavily mortgaged asset, a sprawling, undeveloped parcel of marshland on the city's outskirts, the site of what was to be his comeback project, Thorne Meadows. That was where his path crossed Ilara's once more. The Vance and Clara Foundation, under Ilara's direction, had grown, focusing on urban greening and the preservation of local ecosystems. Her advanced botanical studies had made her an expert in identifying ecologically vital land. When she saw the Thorne Meadows development plans, her trained eye caught something the city planners had missed. The entire area was a rare peat bog, a vital wetland ecosystem, and home to a threatened species of carnivorous pitcher plant, Sarracenia purpurea. Julian Thorne, oblivious, saw only mud and potential profit. He requested a meeting. Ilara agreed, choosing the Vance and Clara headquarters, a beautiful building of reclaimed wood and glass overlooking a rooftop herb garden, as the venue. This was not a negotiation, it was a summons. When Julian walked into her office, the transformation was shocking. He was a hollowed-out effigy of his former self. The razor-sharp suits were gone, replaced by a rumpled, slightly too large blazer of a synthetic material that shone unpleasantly under the lights. It hung off his bony shoulders, the cuffs frayed, and carried a faint, sour smell of neglect and cheap whiskey. His face was gaunt, his skin a pasty grey, and his eyes, once sharp and predatory, held a desperate, hunted look, darting around the room as if expecting an attack. He stood awkwardly in the center of the spacious, light-filled room, a ghost of arrogance haunting his posture. The office itself was a silent rebuke to his entire worldview. Instead of cold marble and steel, the walls were living panels of moss and fern. The desk was carved from a single piece of reclaimed oak, and the air smelled faintly of damp earth and mint from the garden visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Ms. Vance, Ilara," he began, his voice raspy, as if it hadn't been used for anything but pleading for some time. "Thank you for seeing me." "Mr. Thorne," she replied. Her voice was calm, steady, a world away from the trembling whisper he had last heard from her. She remained seated behind her desk, a queen in her own green kingdom, gesturing to a simple wooden chair he did not take. "What can I do for you?" "It's about the meadows," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush, a sheen of sweat on his brow. "My land. I heard your foundation filed an objection with the City Planning Commission, a formal challenge. I need you to withdraw it, immediately." "And why would I do that?" Ilara's voice was even, betraying no emotion. She simply watched him, her gaze analytical, like a botanist studying a wilting plant. A flash of the old Julian appeared, a pathetic echo of his former tyranny. "Look, that land is all I have left. You and that old man, you took everything from me. My company, my reputation, my life. You owe me this. Let me have this one thing. It's just a swamp." Ilara finally stood, but she didn't move towards him. She walked to the large window, her back to him, looking out over the city she now helped to shape. "Let me be very clear, Julian, I owe you nothing. You stood in a crowded restaurant and called me riffraff. You tried to destroy me over the scent of my grandmother's hands. You tried to take my livelihood because of a drop of sauce. You didn't just hand me a sword that night, you forged it, sharpened it, and placed it in my hand, then begged me to use it. You destroyed yourself with your own cruelty. My success and your failure are products of your own character." "It was just a bad night," he insisted, his voice rising in a desperate whine, "a joke that went too far. You can't ruin a man's life over a stain on his suit." "This isn't about a suit, and it was never a joke," she said, turning to face him, her eyes as cold and clear as ice. "This is about the land. Your plans would irrevocably destroy one of the last remaining peat bogs in this region. You see swampland. I see a complex ecosystem that filters our water and harbors irreplaceable biodiversity. You see an obstacle to be conquered. I see a legacy to be preserved. She picked up a small, elegant remote from her oak desk and pressed a button. A section of the living moss wall behind her silently retracted, revealing a large built-in terrarium. Inside, bathed in a soft, specialized light, grew a cluster of strange, beautiful plants, their crimson-veined leaves forming deadly, elegant pictures. Julian stared, uncomprehending. "What is that?" "That," Ilara said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "is your final mistake." She walked to the terrarium, her reflection moving across the glass. "You see a weed. I see Sarracenia purpurea, the purple pitcher plant. A carnivorous marvel and a species protected under state and federal law." She turned back to him, a teacher addressing a particularly slow student. "When your engineers submitted their environmental impact report, the one they falsified, by the way, which we have already reported to the EPA, they listed the area's flora as common reeds and cattails. They missed this. They missed everything." She touched a control on her desk. A large screen on the opposite wall flickered to life, showing a detailed satellite image of the marsh. "You see mud," she said, her voice taking on the crisp authority of a lecturer. "I see this." She zoomed in, highlighting specific areas in shimmering blue. A delicate sphagnum moss habitat that has taken 10,000 years to form. It acts as a massive carbon sink for this entire region. Your plan to drain and fill it wouldn't just be destructive. It would be the ecological equivalent of setting off a bomb, releasing metric tons of sequestered carbon into the atmosphere. He stared at the screen, at the alien plant in its glass case, at the woman who stood before him, calm and unassailable. The technical terms, the scientific certainty. It was a language he didn't speak, a world he had never bothered to understand. He finally saw that he wasn't fighting a grudge. He was fighting facts, science, and the slow, inexorable power of the earth itself. His shoulders slumped in utter defeat. "So that's it," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You've won. Again." "This was never a competition," Ilara said softly, her tone losing its hard edge, replaced by a quiet finality. "It was a consequence. Every action you took, from the smallest cruelty to the largest act of greed, led you directly to this room, to this moment. This is the bill for your life's work, Julian. And it has come due." She let the silence hang in the air for a moment before delivering the final devastating blow. The Vance and Clara Foundation, in partnership with the Pendleton Trust and the city, has made a formal offer to purchase the land from the bank holding your debt. Given the new environmental protections in place, its value as commercial real estate is now zero. The bank, facing a toxic asset and potential fines for its association with your fraudulent report, accepted our offer this morning. Julian looked up, his eyes wide with a fresh, profound horror. "What? What are you going to do with it?" A small, sad smile touched Ilara's lips. "We're going to protect it. We're turning it into a public nature preserve, a place where people can come and learn about the world you tried to pave over." She paused, letting the words land with their full, crushing weight. "We're naming it the Clara Pendleton Memorial Gardens." The name struck him like a physical blow. He staggered back a step, his face a mask of disbelief. His last chance at redemption, his final hope, would now be a living monument to the woman whose memory he had desecrated, the very legacy that had fueled his downfall. It was a karmic checkmate so complete, so poetically just, that it left no room for argument or appeal. It was simply the end. Without another word, Julian Thorne turned and walked out of her office, a man utterly and finally erased by the quiet, powerful forces of the natural world he had so long disdained. 6 months later, the sun shone brightly on the grand opening of the Clara Pendleton Memorial Gardens. A large, elegant crowd of city officials, philanthropists, and environmentalists gathered near the entrance, where a polished wooden stage had been erected. Ilara, dressed in a simple but elegant green linen dress, stood at the podium, addressing the crowd. "This land," she said, her amplified voice clear and steady, is not a monument to what was lost, but a promise of what can be saved. It is a testament to the idea that our greatest legacy is not what we build with steel and glass, but what we choose to protect. It is a sanctuary for weary hands and a worried heart. At the edge of the crowd, a gaunt figure in a stained coat tried to push his way forward. It was Julian. His eyes were wild, fixed on Ilara with a burning, impotent rage. He stumbled past the velvet rope, his voice a raw croak. "She's a fraud, a thief. She stole this from me. It's my land, Thorn Meadows." A few people turned to look at him with annoyance and pity. A young security guard in a crisp uniform stepped in front of him, polite but firm. "Sir, you're causing a disturbance." "I am Julian Thorn," he spat, as if the name still held power. The guard's expression was blank. "Okay, Mr. Thorn, I'm going to have to ask you to step back." Julian made a desperate lunge for the stage, shoving the guard aside. "You have to listen to me," he shrieked, his voice cracking with madness. "She's a liar." He was intercepted by 2 more guards before he could get within 10 feet of the stage. They held him firmly by the arms as he thrashed. Ilara paused her speech, her gaze falling upon him. There was no anger in her eyes, no triumph, only a deep, quiet sadness. The crowd murmured, phones coming out to record the pathetic spectacle. A nearby reporter, catching the commotion, glanced over. She looked at Julian's disheveled form, then back at the glowing Ilara on stage. "Who's that?" she asked her cameraman. "No idea," the cameraman shrugged, keeping his lens focused on Ilara. "Just some drunk. Ignore him." Julian heard them. The words hit him harder than any physical blow. He wasn't a villain. He wasn't even a memory. He was nothing. As Ilara finished her speech to thunderous applause, the security guards gently but inexorably guided the forgotten man away from the celebration of his own ruin. His incoherent screams swallowed by the cheers for the woman he had tried to break. Later, as the crowds thinned, Ilara stood on a wooden boardwalk that snaked through the preserve. The air was cool and damp, smelling of rich earth and wet leaves. Arthur stood beside her, his gaze sweeping across the landscape of green mosses and the deep, mysterious reds of the pitcher plants. He looked more at peace than she had ever seen him. "She would have loved this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "All this life, just being." An older woman with kind eyes and hands that, though no longer chapped, still showed a lifetime of work, joined them on the boardwalk. It was Ilara's grandmother. "It smells like home, doesn't it?" her grandmother said, smiling at Arthur. Arthur nodded, his own smile warm and genuine. He looked from Ilara's grandmother to the memory of his own, seeing the same quiet strength, the same connection to the earth. He then gestured out across the bog to a small rise of land where a cluster of ancient birch trees stood. "My father was born in a small cottage right over there," Arthur said quietly, a new depth of history in his voice. "The Pendletons worked this land for a century before I was born. But during the Depression, Julian Thorn's grandfather, a man with a sharp suit and an empty heart, came calling. He promised jobs at a new factory, offered to buy the land for pennies on the dollar to help families get back on their feet. My grandfather, desperate, sold. The factory was never built. The Thorns just sat on the land, waiting for its value to rise." Ilara stared at him, the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. This wasn't just justice, it was restoration. They built their entire empire on the foundations of my family's hardship and dozens of others like them. Arthur continued, his voice free of bitterness, filled only with a profound sense of closure. "When I started investigating Thorn Industries, it wasn't just about business, it was about memory. Naming this place after my mother, it's not just an honor, it's bringing the land back home." He led them a little further down the boardwalk to where the birch grove began. Half hidden in the moss at the base of the oldest tree was a simple, low stone, weathered but newly cleaned. Carved into it were 2 dates and a name, Pendleton Homestead, 1884-1932. "My grandfather put this here the day they left," Arthur said, his hand resting on the cool stone. A quiet act of defiance, a promise that a piece of them would always remain. For 80 years, the Thorns owned the deed, but they never truly owned the land. It was just waiting. He looked at Ilara, his eyes shining with gratitude. I spent decades looking for a way to legally and ethically reclaim it. A way that honored the land itself, not just my family's name. Julian's greed, his utter blindness to the world beneath his feet, finally gave me the opening. But I only had the map, Ilara. You were the one who found the key. He placed his hand on her shoulder. My mother's memory brought us together. But your knowledge, your passion for the earth itself, is what brought this land back to life. You didn't just win an argument in an office, you spoke for the 10,000 years of history in this soil. And it listened. Ilara knelt down, her fingers gently tracing the rim of one of the carnivorous plants. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, from the stifling opulence of Aurelia to this wild, breathing sanctuary. She had not just built a company, she had reclaimed a legacy, defended the earth and cultivated a future from the seeds of the past. The faint, clean scent of the bog rose up to meet her, a fragrance far richer and more profound than any perfume. It was the scent of her victory, the smell of justice, the smell of home.